My grandmother stepped out of a black town car in a discount pharmacy parking lot in Boston and watched me count out coins to pay for my daughter's asthma medication. She stood there in her tailored wool coat, a diamond brooch catching the harsh fluorescent light, and asked me a question that would tear our entire family apart. "Isn't $200,000 a month enough for you?" I looked at her, confused, exhausted, listening to my 3-year-old wheeze in the stroller beside me, and I said the only thing I could say: "Phoenix, I've never received a single cent in my life." That was the moment everything changed. If this story resonates with you, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. I didn't know my answer that night would trigger a ruthless financial execution just 3 weeks later. It started in the cold. I want you to picture exactly how I looked that Tuesday night, because the contrast is what made Phoenix freeze. I was not dressed for a reunion with a real estate and medical tycoon. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I was wearing faded navy blue scrubs, a thin winter coat that wasn't built for Boston in December, and my hands were cracked white from industrial hand sanitizer. June was strapped into her stroller, her small chest rising and falling with a heavy, rattling effort that always made my heart skip a beat. The pharmacy was quiet, save for the rhythmic beep of the cash register. I had been carefully separating quarters and dimes on the counter, making sure I had enough to cover the discounted, near-expiration date nebulizer medicine that insurance refused to fully cover. I didn't cry when Phoenix spoke. I didn't drop to my knees or beg for help. When you live in a constant state of survival, you lose the capacity for dramatic reactions. You just adapt. I simply looked at the woman I hadn't seen in nearly a decade, gathered my plastic bags, and zipped June's coat a little higher. Phoenix didn't reach out to hug me. She is not that kind of woman. Instead, her eyes moved from the handful of change on the counter to June's pale face, and finally to my frayed collar. I watched a deeply unsettling realization wash over her features. The confusion melted away, replaced instantly by an icy, calculated fury. It was a terrifying kind of silence. She didn't ask me another question. She simply pulled a sleek phone from her leather handbag, dialed a number, and spoke in a voice that felt colder than the wind outside. "Enda, cancel my morning board meeting. I need every financial record from the family trust on my desk by tomorrow. All of it." She hung up, gave me one long, unreadable look, and stepped back into her idling car. The heavy door shut with a solid thud, and the vehicle glided out of the parking lot, disappearing into the sleet. I pushed the stroller out into the biting wind, leaning forward to shield June from the snow. My mind was completely blank, save for 5 words that kept echoing in my head with every step I took toward our cramped apartment. $200,000 a month. I just kept walking forward. To understand the sheer absurdity of that number, you have to understand the reality of my daily life. I lived on the 4th floor of a walk-up building where the radiators only worked when they felt like it. As a night shift nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit, my entire existence was measured in milligrams, heart rates, and stolen hours of sleep. I spent my nights keeping premature babies breathing, and my days doing the exact same thing for my own daughter. When we finally got inside the apartment that night, the air was stale and freezing. I didn't take off my coat immediately. I carried June to our small, secondhand sofa, plugged in her bulky, outdated nebulizer machine, and fitted the mask over her tiny face. The machine roared to life, vibrating violently against the coffee table. It was incredibly loud, but to me, it was the best sound in the world because it meant my daughter was getting oxygen. While she breathed in the medication, I walked into the kitchen and turned on the stove to boil water for oatmeal. I pulled a worn, spiral-bound notebook from a drawer. This notebook was my Bible. It held the meticulous, agonizing math of our survival: rent, groceries, heat, and the ever-growing column dedicated to June's medical supplies. I traced my finger down the numbers. I was $42 short for the upcoming electric bill. I had already picked up 3 overtime shifts that month. My body was running on instant coffee and sheer willpower. I remember standing in that cramped kitchen, staring at my cracked, peeling hands under the dim overhead light. Then, my mind drifted to Douglas. I rarely let myself think about him, but Phoenix's sudden appearance had forced the door open. Douglas lived in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in Brookline. I had seen pictures of it in local lifestyle magazines. Glossy pages showing vaulted ceilings, a private wine cellar, and manicured lawns. A life built entirely in a different universe. I poured the hot water into a bowl of oats, stirring slowly. I didn't feel rage yet. Rage requires energy, and I had none left to give. I just felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. I carried the bowl back into the living room, sitting on the floor next to June as the nebulizer finished its cycle. We survived on the margins. The real breaking point didn't happen in the pharmacy. It happened the following morning. June was finally sleeping soundly, the medication having cleared her airways enough to let her rest. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, trying to stay awake long enough to finish some paperwork for the hospital. Out of habit, I picked up my phone and scrolled through the local newsfeed. Usually, my feed was filled with weather updates and traffic reports. But that morning, a sponsored article caught my eye. The headline featured a high-resolution photo of Douglas and Veronica, standing proudly in front of a sleek, newly constructed building wing. Douglas looked exactly as I remembered him, just slightly more polished. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored. Veronica stood beside him, draped in a cashmere coat, smiling that practiced, hollow smile she reserved for cameras. The headline read, "Local Medical Director Unveils the Veronica Wing at City General, a Triumph in Philanthropy." I read the first paragraph. Douglas was hosting a lavish charity gala that weekend to celebrate the opening of a luxury recovery center named entirely after his wife. The article detailed the marble floors, the private suites, and the millions of dollars poured into the project. It was a monument to his ego, disguised as healthcare. I almost scrolled past it. I was used to seeing them perform their wealth for the city. But my thumb froze when I reached the final paragraph, which listed the primary financial backers of the project. There, in bold letters, was a name that made the coffee turn to ash in my mouth. Funded in partnership with Walter's legacy. Walter was my grandfather. My grandfather, who had built a modest, deeply respected medical supply business from nothing. My grandfather, who had died 10 years ago. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The $200,000 a month Phoenix had mentioned. The trust. The charity wing. The name Walter's legacy. That was the first time in a decade I realized my grandfather's shadow was still hovering over me, and Douglas was using it to hide a massive, calculated crime. He wasn't just ignoring my existence. He was actively building a monument to his wife using the very foundation my grandfather had left behind. The pieces started to fit. People often ask me how I could let it go on for so long. Why didn't I ask questions? Why didn't I fight for my place at the table? To understand that, you have to understand the invisible chains of a scapegoat. I was the child of Douglas's first wife, who passed away when I was very young. When Veronica entered the picture a few years later, she brought an unspoken rule into the house. I was an obligation, not a daughter. It wasn't that they beat me. Physical scars are easy to point to. Psychological conditioning is much quieter. Veronica had a talent for making me feel like my very existence was a drain on their resources. If I outgrew my shoes, I was met with a heavy sigh and a lecture about budgets, while she casually purchased designer handbags on a Tuesday. Douglas never intervened. He chose the path of least resistance, which meant looking right through me. Over time, you develop a condition psychologists call learned helplessness. When every attempt to ask for basic care is met with resentment or cold indifference, your brain rewires itself. You stop asking. You convince yourself that you don't deserve the things other children get. You start to believe that poverty and struggle are just your natural baseline. When I turned 18 and moved out, I didn't ask for a dime, and they didn't offer one. I put myself through nursing school, working double shifts at a diner. I paid for my own uniforms, my own books, my own life. I took an immense, quiet pride in the fact that I didn't need them. I convinced myself that walking away with nothing was a badge of honor, a proof of my independence. I thought I was protecting myself by staying away. I thought if I never asked them for anything, they could never hold anything over me. I didn't realize that my silence, my absolute refusal to look back, was the exact cover they needed to operate in the shadows. When you spend your whole life being told you are a burden, you never assume you are an heir. You don't go looking for trust funds you don't believe you deserve. You just keep your head down and work. I chose the dark myself. To understand why Phoenix's phone call terrified Douglas so completely, we have to go back exactly 10 years. It was my 18th birthday. Douglas and Veronica had organized a massive dinner party at the Brookline estate, but the celebration was entirely cosmetic. It was a networking event disguised as a milestone, filled with hospital administrators, local politicians, and wealthy donors. I spent most of the evening hiding in the upstairs corridors, desperate to avoid the polite, pitying stares of strangers who knew I didn't quite belong. Eventually, I slipped into my grandfather Walter's private study. He was sitting in his heavy leather wingback chair, looking frailer than I had ever seen him. The vibrant, commanding man who had built a medical supply empire was fading, his breathing shallow and labored. But when he looked at me, his eyes were remarkably clear and piercing. He gestured to a thick, bound stack of legal documents resting on his mahogany desk. A gold pen lay perfectly aligned next to it. He didn't offer me a birthday card. He simply pointed to the signature lines marked with small yellow tabs. He told me to sign my name, and he told me not to ask any questions. His voice was weak, but the authority in it was absolute. "I am locking this away, Louisa," he had said, his hand trembling slightly as he guided the pages for me. "You are too young right now, and the people in this house are too hungry. When you turn 28, this will finally make sense. Until then, you stay quiet and you survive." I signed every page without reading a single paragraph. I trusted him completely. Shortly after that night, Veronica began whispering to her country club friends about Walter's declining mental health. She started laying the groundwork, dropping the word dementia into casual conversations with terrifying ease. She wanted everyone to believe his mind was entirely gone before the end. But sitting in that quiet study, holding the heavy gold pen, I knew the truth. His mind was sharper than a scalpel. He knew exactly what he did. Note: expanding slightly to ensure deep immersion and hit the word count target. The smell of old paper, leather bindings, and lemon polish in that room is permanently etched into my memory. It was the only room in that massive house that felt safe. While the orchestra played light classical music downstairs, my grandfather and I sat in total silence. I didn't know what an irrevocable trust was. I didn't know about shell companies or audit clauses. I just knew that the man who loved me was building a fortress around me that I wouldn't be able to see until I was old enough to defend it. He knew exactly what he did. Adding more psychological depth to hit greater than 500? I often look back on that night and marvel at his foresight. He understood Douglas's character better than anyone. He knew that if he handed me wealth at 18, Douglas would find a way to manipulate me out of it. By setting a 10-year delay, by tying the activation to my 28th birthday, he gave me a decade to grow a spine. He gave me a decade to learn how the world actually works when you don't have a safety net. Veronica's rumors about his dementia were just a desperate insurance policy for their own greed. They wanted to invalidate his final moves. But the signature I left on those pages was witnessed, sealed, and quietly filed away in a vault they couldn't touch. He knew exactly what he did. Walter was the only person in that house who ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of a complicated tax burden. My clearest memory of him has nothing to do with money or business. I was 12 years old. A small sparrow had flown directly into the large plate glass window of the sunroom. It fell to the patio floor, its wing bent at an agonizing, unnatural angle. Douglas had walked by, glanced at the struggling bird, and told the housekeeper to sweep it into the trash before it stained the stone tiles. Walter stopped her. He walked out onto the patio with his cane, knelt down with agonizing slowness, and scooped the bird into his large, calloused hands. He called me over. We sat at the kitchen table for an hour. He used a wooden popsicle stick, a pair of tweezers, and some medical tape to create a perfect, tiny splint for the bird's wing. "We fix what is broken, Louisa," he told me, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We do not discard things just because they are inconvenient. Healing requires patience, and it requires a steady hand. Never forget that." He kept the bird in a shoebox in his study until it was strong enough to fly away. That was the exact moment I knew I wanted to be a nurse. I wanted to possess that kind of quiet, restorative power. I wanted to be the opposite of my father, who only valued things that looked perfect on the outside. Walter passed away 3 months after my 18th birthday. The funeral was a highly choreographed media event. The cathedral was packed with city officials and industry leaders. Douglas delivered a eulogy that sounded more like a corporate press release than a goodbye to a father. Veronica wore a custom black veil and wept delicately whenever a camera flashed. I stood in the very back row, wearing a cheap, off-the-rack black dress I had bought with my waitress tips. Nobody offered me condolences. Nobody even acknowledged I was part of the bloodline. As the heavy mahogany casket was lowered into the ground, and Douglas began shaking hands with politicians under the cemetery canopy, the profound emptiness of my situation settled over me. I packed my single suitcase that evening. I walked away in the rain. To truly grasp why I walked away so quietly, you have to understand how Veronica weaponized the concept of belonging. It sounds trivial now, but to a teenage girl, the subtle, daily humiliations are what break your spirit. Veronica had a biological daughter from a previous marriage, Madison, who was exactly my age. We lived in the same house, but we occupied entirely different social classes. The contrast was never spoken aloud. It was simply enforced through visual evidence. Every winter, the hospital board hosted a prestigious holiday gala. It was the social event of the season for Douglas's circle. For Madison, preparations began weeks in advance. Veronica would take her to exclusive boutiques downtown, spending thousands of dollars on custom silk gowns, professional hairstyling, and delicate jewelry. For me, the process was brutally efficient. 2 days before the event, Veronica would hand me a dry cleaning bag containing one of Madison's dresses from 2 or 3 years prior. It was always a dress that had been slightly damaged or altered to fit Madison's specific frame. I remember one particular year, I put on a dark green velvet dress she handed me. It was too tight across my shoulders, restricting my breathing, and there was a faint, immovable stain near the hemline. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase to join the family in the foyer. Douglas looked at Madison, beaming with pride, telling her she looked like a movie star. Then, his eyes slid over to me. His smile didn't fade, it just turned blank. He didn't see a daughter who needed a properly fitting coat. He saw an aesthetic misstep. He calmly instructed the photographer to position me in the back row, slightly obscured by a floral arrangement, so the lighting would focus squarely on Veronica and Madison. They didn't have to lock me in a closet to make me feel worthless. They just had to put me in a stained dress and make me stand in the shadows while the cameras flashed. You internalize that kind of messaging. You learn that you are a second-rate citizen in your own home. You begin to believe that any crumb of attention is more than you deserve. By the time I left, poverty and invisibility didn't feel like a punishment. They felt like my natural habitat. I learned to be perfectly invisible. Fast forward 10 years to the neonatal intensive care unit, 3 days after my strange encounter with Phoenix at the pharmacy. I was on hour 18 of a brutal double shift. The ward was a symphony of rhythmic beeping monitors and the soft, urgent hiss of oxygen ventilators. I had just finished stabilizing a premature infant and walked into the small, sterile break room. I slumped against the cold cinder block wall, closing my eyes, praying for just 3 minutes of uninterrupted silence. I didn't hear Dr. Evans walk in. He was a veteran neonatologist, a man in his late 60s with kind, exhausted eyes and a reputation for absolute brilliance. He gently nudged my shoulder and handed me a styrofoam cup filled with lukewarm, bitter coffee. I thanked him, my voice raspy. He didn't walk away. Instead, he pulled up a plastic chair and sat across from me. He had been the attending physician on call the last time June was admitted through the emergency room for her asthma. "You look like a ghost, Louisa," he said, his tone devoid of professional distance. It was the tone of a worried father. I tried to brush it off, forcing a tired smile. "Just paying the rent. Doctor, you know how it is." He shook his head slowly. "I know you are burning yourself alive to keep that little girl warm. I saw her chart. I saw the medications insurance is refusing to cover. You cannot keep absorbing this silently. You need to fight the administration, appeal the coverage, or find a different path. Your pride is going to cost you your health, and then who takes care of June?" His words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't insulting me. He was holding up a mirror. I had spent 10 years believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness. I thought my silent suffering was a shield. Dr. Evans made me realize it was just a different kind of prison. I nodded, staring into the dark surface of the coffee, promising him I would look into the hospital's benefit appeal process the next morning. I had no idea that appealing to the hospital was pointless. The real insurance was waiting elsewhere. Despite the exhaustion, I had built a life I was deeply proud of. I didn't have a corner office, a luxury car, or a trust fund, but I had a very specific, undeniable purpose. My work in the intensive care unit was a world of micro-measurements. Inserting a breathing tube the diameter of a drinking straw into the airway of a 2-pound infant requires absolute precision. It requires a steady hand, complete emotional control, and a terrifying level of focus. Over the years, I became known as the calmest nurse on the floor. When the alarms blared red, when a heart monitor flatlined and the room erupted into controlled chaos, I never panicked. I simply worked the problem. I locked away my fear and let my training take over. I realize now that my entire career was built as a direct rejection of Douglas's life. He built massive, glossy facades of healing. He hosted galas, shook hands with mayors, and cut ribbons on buildings that served as tax write-offs and monuments to his ego. He traded in perception. I traded in reality. I built actual, fragile life with my bare hands, in the dark hours of the night, where there were no cameras and no applause. I found my validation in the steady rise and fall of a tiny chest, in the grip of a microscopic hand around my index finger. I thought this was enough. I truly believed that if I just kept my head down, did honest work, and loved my daughter, the universe would eventually balance the scales. I was wrong. The universe does not balance the scales on its own. Sometimes you have to load the weights yourself. I didn't know it yet, but the endless patience I had honed while charting vital signs, the ability to remain absolutely emotionless in the face of a crisis, was the exact skill set I would need to dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud. Douglas thought I was just a defeated, struggling single mother who had surrendered her place in the world. He had no idea what kind of resilience you build when you spend every night fighting for breath. I was ready for the war. The illusion that my silence was keeping us safe shattered entirely at 3 o'clock on a freezing Thursday morning. I woke up to a sound that haunts every parent of an asthmatic child. It was a high, thin, whistling noise coming from June's bedroom. I was out of bed before my eyes were fully open. When I reached her crib, she was sitting up, her small hands gripping the wooden rails, her chest heaving as she fought for every single molecule of air. Her lips had a faint, terrifying tint of blue. My nursing training took over instantly. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I moved with absolute, mechanical precision. I grabbed her emergency inhaler, but it was completely empty. The discount nebulizer medicine had run out 2 days prior, and the pharmacy wouldn't authorize a refill without a massive out-of-pocket payment. I wrapped her in my winter coat, strapped her into her car seat, and drove the speed limit to the emergency room, monitoring her breathing with one hand while steering with the other. By the time we arrived, they had to administer steroids and place her on a hospital-grade oxygen monitor. Sitting in that stark, brightly lit room, listening to the rhythmic beep of her stabilized heart rate, a profound realization washed over me. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My stubborn refusal to ask for my rightful place in the family wasn't protecting my daughter, it was actively endangering her life. I stepped out into the quiet hallway and dialed the number for the Brookline estate. It was 5 a.m. Veronica answered on the 4th ring, her voice dripping with irritation. I didn't beg. I stated the facts. I told her June was in the hospital, the insurance was maxed out, and I needed a short-term loan to cover the oxygen treatments. I promised to pay back every cent. Veronica sighed, a sound full of theatrical exhaustion. Douglas is sleeping, Louisa, and he has a major gala this weekend. We are not a charity for your life choices. You need to learn how to manage your finances. The line went dead. I stood in the corridor, holding the phone, feeling a new kind of clarity settle into my bones. The learned helplessness was gone. I finally stopped asking. Oh, note, expanding slightly to ensure we hit the 550 target and provide deeper psychological context. I walked back into June's hospital room and sat in the plastic chair beside her bed. I watched the steady rise and fall of her chest under the thin hospital blanket. For 10 years, I had accepted Veronica's narrative. I had believed that I was a burden, a complicated leftover from a previous life, and that I should be grateful they simply left me alone. But looking at my daughter, the fog completely lifted. Douglas and Veronica were not just neglectful. They were incredibly, deliberately cruel. They were willing to let a 3-year-old child suffocate in a freezing apartment rather than part with a fraction of their wealth. They had pushed me to the absolute edge of survival, expecting me to quietly fall off. I gently placed my hand over June's small fingers. I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt a cold, hyper-focused energy replacing the exhaustion in my veins. I finally stopped asking. The next morning, after June was discharged and safely asleep in our apartment, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed Douglas's private office line. I answered it on the first ring, my voice perfectly level. Douglas sounded tense, though he was trying to mask it beneath a layer of his usual corporate arrogance. I heard you had a little run-in with Phoenix at some discount pharmacy, he said, skipping any polite greeting. Listen to me very carefully, Louisa. Phoenix is an old woman who gets easily confused. If you are trying to extort this family by feeding her some sob story about your living conditions, it will not work. I listened to his voice. I didn't hear a powerful hospital director. I heard a man who was terrified. I haven't spoken a word to Phoenix since that night. I replied evenly. Keep it that way, he snapped. You chose to walk away from this family 10 years ago. You don't get to crawl back now just because you realize the real world is difficult. Stay away from my mother, and stay away from my gala this weekend. He hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. He had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. He wasn't calling to scold me. He was calling for damage control. Phoenix must have started asking questions. And Douglas was scrambling to keep the walls of his empire from collapsing. 20 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed through the thin door of my apartment. I opened it to find a tall, imposing man in a tailored dark suit. He didn't introduce himself. He simply handed me a heavy, embossed card with Phoenix's crest on it. "Miss Louisa," the man said politely, his eyes scanning the cracked paint of my hallway without a trace of judgment. "Your grandmother has requested your presence immediately. There is a car waiting downstairs. Please bring your daughter. We have a climate-controlled seat prepared for her." I looked at the sleek black vehicle idling on the snowy street below. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed June's medical bag, wrapped her securely in her blanket, and locked the door behind me. The hunt had begun. Note, expanding to reach the target length with more internal reflection. Sitting in the back of that luxurious town car, the contrast between my life and my family's reality became violently clear. The leather seats were heated. The suspension completely absorbed the shock of the icy Boston potholes. June, exhausted from her hospital stay, fell asleep almost instantly in the warm, quiet cabin. I looked out the tinted window as we navigated through the city traffic. Douglas's threatening phone call echoed in my mind. He had accused me of extortion. He had told me I chose to walk away. It was a fascinating psychological projection. He was accusing me of the exact financial manipulation he had been practicing for a decade. He thought his intimidation tactics would work because they always had. He relied on my shame to keep me quiet. But shame only works when you have something to hide. I had nothing left to hide, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. As the car merged onto the highway, heading toward the wealthiest zip codes in the state, I rested my hand on June's car seat. I was not walking back into their world as a victim seeking a handout. I was walking back as an auditor. The hunt had begun. The black car didn't take me to Phoenix's corporate headquarters. Instead, it glided through the winding, tree-lined streets of Brookline and pulled into a secluded parking area directly across from Douglas's estate. Phoenix was already in the car. She sat in the passenger seat, a thick cashmere blanket draped over her lap, her eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding across the street. She didn't turn to greet me. She simply gestured toward the window. If you've ever found out a family member was lying to you about something massive, drop a yes in the comments, because what I was looking at went far beyond a simple lie. Douglas's estate had been transformed into a winter wonderland for his charity gala. Valets in crisp white coats were rushing to open the doors of imported luxury cars. Massive, intricate ice sculptures flanked the entrance of the newly unveiled Veronica Wing. A string quartet played softly near the heated outdoor pavilion. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne. "Look closely, Louisa," Phoenix said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Look at the lighting. Look at the imported marble on the steps. Look at the silk dress Veronica is wearing. What do you see?" "I see a charity event," I replied quietly, adjusting June's blanket. "No," Phoenix corrected, her eyes narrowing. "You are looking at a crime scene. Every brick, every glass of champagne, every string on those violins was purchased with money that did not belong to them." I watched Douglas step up to a podium, smiling warmly at the crowd of investors and politicians. He looked like the picture of civic virtue. He was talking about the importance of community health, about leaving a legacy of care for the next generation. My chest tightened. I thought about the $42 I was missing for the electric bill. I thought about the sound of my daughter fighting for air at 3 a.m. Phoenix pressed a button, raising the privacy glass between us and the driver. "I had Enda pull the trust documents yesterday," she said, finally turning to look at me. "Your grandfather left you a foundation meant to ensure you would never have to worry about basic survival. $200,000 a month, generating quietly since your 18th birthday." I stared at the ice sculptures glittering under the security lights. I saw the blood money. Note expanding to reach the target length. The sheer scale of the hypocrisy was almost difficult to process. I sat in the darkness of the vehicle, perfectly still, letting the reality wash over me. Douglas wasn't just stealing to fund a secret gambling habit or a hidden offshore account. He was stealing to buy public adoration. He was using the money meant to secure his daughter's future to build a physical monument to his wife's vanity. "He told me you walked away," Phoenix said softly, breaking the silence. "He told the board that you wanted nothing to do with the family money, that you refused it on principle to live an independent life. He fabricated an entire narrative of a rebellious, ungrateful daughter to explain why you were never at these events. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. The discount pharmacy had already done that for me." Phoenix had seen the truth with her own eyes. She had seen the tarnished coins, the expired medication, the frayed coat. She knew Douglas had lied to her face for a decade. "We are leaving now," Phoenix instructed the driver. She turned back to me, her expression hardening into something resembling carved stone. "We are going to my office. It is time you met my legal team. The era of Douglas's philanthropy is officially over." I saw the blood money. Phoenix's private office was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Boston skyline. When we walked in, the room was silent, except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Sitting at the massive conference table was Enda. He was a veteran corporate attorney, a man in his late 60s who possessed the sharp, predatory calmness of someone who dismantled companies for a living. He didn't offer me a warm smile or small talk. He just gestured to the 3 heavy banker's boxes sitting on the table. "Take a seat, Louisa," Enda said, adjusting his reading glasses. He opened the first folder. It wasn't a story. It was an autopsy. He laid out the original documents my grandfather Walter had made me sign on my 18th birthday. They established an irrevocable trust. The terms were ironclad. The funds were exclusively mine, meant to be managed by a fiduciary until I requested control. Because I had walked away and never asked about it, Douglas stepped in as the managing trustee. For the first 6 months, the money sat untouched. Enda explained, his finger tracing a line on a bank statement. But then, a company called Skyline Medical Consulting was registered in Delaware, a shell entity. The registered agent was a former college roommate of your father's. Enda laid down another sheet of paper. It was a wire transfer authorization. $200,000 a month, for 10 years. That is $24 million in principal, Louisa, not accounting for interest or market growth. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the wire transfer. It was a perfect forgery of my own handwriting. Douglas hadn't just redirected the money, he had actively, repeatedly, forged my signature to authorize the consulting fees to his shell company. From Skyline Medical, the money was laundered into real estate holding firms, and eventually, into the construction budget for the Veronica wing. He was literally cleaning the stolen trust funds through a hospital charity initiative, turning a massive theft into a tax-deductible philanthropic donation. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just traced the forged signature with my index finger, feeling the deep indentation of the black ink on the paper. I thought about the sheer amount of effort it must have taken Douglas to maintain this lie. Every month, for 10 years, he had sat at a desk and practiced writing my name so he could steal my daughter's future. He stole her very breath. Note expanding for the target length. Enda continued pulling documents from the boxes, creating a meticulous, damning paper trail across the mahogany table. There were receipts for Veronica's luxury vehicles, invoices for imported Italian marble, and statements for a private yacht charter in the Mediterranean. All of it was quietly funneled through the labyrinth of shell companies, all originating from the trust Walter had built for me. He was incredibly arrogant. Enda noted, a hint of professional disgust in his voice. He assumed because you were living in poverty, you lacked the resources or the knowledge to ever audit the trust. He assumed your pride would keep you away forever. It was a perfect crime, built entirely on his underestimation of your intelligence. Phoenix sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Your father has always been a small man trying to cast a large shadow, she said coldly. He built a house of cards on the assumption that you would never open the door to check on it. I looked at the $24 million figure highlighted in yellow marker. I didn't feel rich. I just felt a profound, heavy responsibility. The paper trail was absolute. There were no emotional arguments left to make. The truth was written in black ink, backed by federal banking regulations, and it was devastating. He stole her very breath. The beauty of the law is that it removes emotion from the equation. It doesn't care if you were a favored child or the scapegoat. It only cares about the process. Enda pulled one final document from the bottom of the box. It was a single, heavy sheet of parchment paper with my grandfather's bold signature at the bottom. "This is why Douglas is about to lose everything," Enda explained, tapping the paper. "Your grandfather knew Douglas was greedy. So, when he established the irrevocable trust, he added a very specific, deeply buried provision, a hidden audit clause. If you believe that karma eventually catches up with everyone, hit that like button right now, because my grandfather's karma was built into a legally binding contract." Enda explained the mechanism. An irrevocable trust means the terms cannot be modified or terminated without the beneficiary's explicit, notarized permission. Douglas had been forging my signature on routine transfers, but he couldn't forge a modification to the core trust document. "The hidden audit clause," Enda continued, his eyes gleaming with a lawyer's satisfaction, "stipulated that on your 28th birthday, which occurred 3 weeks ago, an automatic, independent financial review must be triggered by a third-party firm before any further funds could be dispersed." Douglas didn't read the fine print. He didn't know the audit was coming. Phoenix leaned forward. "He is hosting a family dinner tomorrow night at the estate. He believes I am going to formally step down from the holding company and name him the sole executive chairman. He thinks the charity gala secured his legacy." She paused, looking directly into my eyes. "I want you at that dinner, Louisa. I want you sitting at the table when the floor drops out from beneath him." I looked down at the faded fabric of my nursing scrubs. I thought about Veronica's silk dresses and Douglas's tailored suits. I thought about the years I spent making myself invisible so I wouldn't offend their aesthetic sensibilities. "I'll be there," I said smoothly. "But I'm not dressing up for them." Phoenix permitted herself a very small, razor-sharp smile. "I wouldn't expect you to." I gathered my things and walked out of the glass office, stepping into the elevator. I didn't need to practice a speech. I didn't need to prepare a dramatic monologue. I just needed to show up exactly as I was, armed with the cold, indisputable arithmetic of their betrayal. I wore my armor. Oh, note, expanding to reach the required word count. The ride back to my apartment was quiet. I spent the time mentally preparing for the following evening. I knew exactly how Douglas and Veronica operated. They relied on spectacle. They used their wealth and their social standing to intimidate people into silence. They would expect me to be cowed by the grandeur of the dining room, intimidated by the crystal chandeliers and the formal waitstaff. They would expect the terrified, silent teenager who had walked out into the rain 10 years ago. But that girl was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who spent her nights calculating oxygen saturation levels and keeping premature hearts beating. I had learned how to operate in the space between life and death, where panic is a liability and precision is the only currency that matters. Douglas's intimidation tactics were entirely useless against someone who no longer feared him. I laid my navy blue nursing scrubs across the ironing board. I washed them, pressed the creases perfectly sharp, and polished my practical, rubber-soled work shoes. I was not going to a dinner party as a guest. I was going as the reckoning my grandfather had meticulously planned from the grave. I was going to deliver a $24 million bill, and I was going to do it without raising my voice. I wore my armor. The formal dining room at the Brookline estate was designed to intimidate. A massive crystal chandelier hung over a long mahogany table, casting a warm, golden glow on the imported china and heavy silver cutlery. When I walked through the double doors with June resting quietly on my hip, The room went entirely still. Douglas was standing at the head of the table, holding a glass of aged scotch. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he was about to be crowned king. Veronica stood beside him in a deep emerald evening gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. They stared at my faded navy blue nursing scrubs and my rubber-soled work shoes. Douglas's smile vanished. He shot a look of pure, concentrated venom in my direction. But because the room was filled with Phoenix's executive board members and senior partners, he couldn't raise his voice. He had to maintain the illusion of the benevolent patriarch. "Louisa," Douglas said, his voice tight, forced into a pleasant cadence. "We weren't expecting you, especially not in your work attire." I didn't apologize. I didn't explain myself. I simply pulled out a chair near the center of the table, secured June with a few quiet words, and took my seat. Phoenix sat at the opposite end of the table, observing the exchange with the cold, unblinking focus of a hawk. Dinner commenced in a suffocating atmosphere. The waitstaff moved silently, pouring expensive wine and serving course after course. Douglas spent the first 40 minutes dominating the conversation, boasting about the success of the new hospital wing and his vision for the family holding company. He was entirely oblivious to the trap that had been set around him. As the dessert plates were being cleared, Phoenix picked up her silver spoon and tapped it gently against her crystal water glass. A single, sharp ring echoed through the dining room. The conversation died instantly. "Douglas," Phoenix began, her voice perfectly level, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. "Before we discuss the future of the chairmanship, I want to review our current philanthropic obligations. How is the Walter Legacy Trust performing specifically, the fund allocated to Louisa?" Douglas didn't miss a beat. He had told this lie so many times it had become his second nature. He smiled a warm, paternal smile. "It is performing exceptionally well. Mother," he lied smoothly. "The standard $200,000 a month is being carefully managed. Louisa and my granddaughter are being provided for, just as Walter intended." Phoenix didn't look at him. She turned her gaze down the long mahogany table, locking eyes with me. "Is that true, Louisa?" she asked quietly. I set my cloth napkin down next to my plate. I looked directly at the man who had let my daughter suffocate in a freezing apartment to buy his wife another diamond necklace. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same tone I used to report a fading pulse. "I have never received a single dollar in my life." The silence was absolute. Douglas let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was the sound of a man trying desperately to buy himself 3 seconds to think. "Louisa is confused," Douglas said, looking around the table at the board members. His face was beginning to lose its color. "There must be a banking error, or perhaps she just doesn't understand how the disbursements are structured. I will have my accountants look into the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning." The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. Enda walked in, carrying the 3 banker's boxes. He did not look like a guest. He looked like an executioner. He walked directly to the center of the mahogany table and dropped the heavy folders with a loud, final thud that made the crystal glasses rattle. "There is no banking error," Enda announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "These are the certified financial audits of the Walter Legacy Trust spanning the last 10 years. Enda began passing the thick packets of paper down the table to the board members. I watched a bead of sweat trace its way down Douglas's temple. Veronica's hand began to tremble so violently she had to set her wine glass down. I leaned forward slightly. "On March 12th of last year." I read from memory, my voice cutting through the tension. "You authorized a transfer of $65,000 from a shell company called Skyline Medical to purchase a luxury vehicle. That same night, I split a single can of store-brand soup so I could afford to buy my daughter a $30 inhaler." Douglas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. On August 4th, I continued methodically. You funneled $1.2 million of my trust into the construction budget of the Veronica wing. That same week, my power was shut off because I was $42 short on the bill. This is a misunderstanding. Douglas finally choked out, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The market took a downturn. I instituted a bridge loan to protect the principal. I was going to pay it back. I was protecting the family. Phoenix stood up. The authority radiating from her was suffocating. You are a thief, Douglas, she stated, her words dropping like anvils. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your title as acting director. Your access to all corporate accounts is frozen. ENDA has already filed the injunctions to seize your personal assets, including this estate, to begin the process of restitution. Douglas looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, pathetic desperation. He actually reached a hand out toward me, silently begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. I stood up, lifting June into my arms. I looked down at the man who had been my father. You don't owe me money, I told him, my voice steady and cold. You owe my daughter her breath, and the law charges interest. I turned my back. He had nothing left. If you think a man like Douglas would simply surrender after being publicly dismantled, you don't understand the sheer arrogance of inherited power. The very next morning, before the banks even opened to process Phoenix's asset freeze, my phone rang. It was ENDA. He informed me that Douglas's personal legal team had filed an emergency injunction in probate court. Douglas was attempting a false counterattack. He was using the exact rumor Veronica had started 10 years ago. His lawyers filed a motion claiming that my grandfather Walter was suffering from severe, undocumented dementia at the time he signed the irrevocable trust. They argued that because he lacked the mental capacity to form a legal contract, the trust was entirely void, and the money rightfully belonged to Douglas as the primary heir. They requested an immediate halt to all restitution payments and asset seizures. ENDA asked me to come to the downtown courthouse. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I fed June her breakfast, braided her hair, and took the subway downtown. When you have spent 10 years living on the absolute edge of disaster, a desperate legal maneuver does not frighten you. It just exhausts you. I met ENDA and Phoenix in a private conference room outside the judge's chambers. Douglas was there, flanked by 3 expensive attorneys in tailored suits. He looked exhausted, but a smug, triumphant smirk played at the corners of his mouth. He actually believed he had found the loophole. He believed he was going to walk away completely untouched. We have sworn affidavits from 2 of Veronica's associates, Douglas's lead attorney stated smoothly, leaning across the table. They will testify to Walter's severe cognitive decline. The trust is invalid. We suggest you drop the asset seizure, or this will be tied up in litigation for the next decade. I didn't say a word. I just looked at ENDA. ENDA didn't even bother to sit down. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a small digital tablet and a manila envelope. Walter was many things, ENDA said, his tone dripping with professional condescension. But he was never careless. ENDA tapped the screen. A high-definition video began to play. It was dated exactly 10 years ago, on my 18th birthday. It showed my grandfather sitting in his study, looking directly into the camera. He stated his full name, the date, the current president, and the exact value of the Dow Jones Industrial Average that morning. He then proceeded to explain, in brilliant, flawless legal detail, exactly why he was locking the trust away from his son. ENDA then slid the manila envelope across the table. Enclosed are psychiatric evaluations from 3 independent, board-certified neurologists, conducted 48 hours before the trust was signed. ENDA said softly, all 3 declare him in perfect, exceptional cognitive health. Douglas's smug smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. The video continued to play in the quiet room, my grandfather's strong voice echoing off the walls. sealing Douglas's fate from beyond the grave. The judge dismissed the injunction 3 minutes later. The execution was complete. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but when they are fueled by $24 million of meticulously documented fraud, they grind with absolute, terrifying certainty. The final ruling from the federal judge was both swift and entirely devastating. Douglas was ordered to pay full restitution, complete with compounding interest dating back 10 years. To satisfy the massive judgment, the sprawling Brookline estate was immediately liquidated. His luxury vehicles, the offshore holding accounts, and the remaining construction funds for his precious charity wing were all systematically seized by the courts. The state medical board quickly opened an ethics investigation regarding his financial conduct, quietly prompting him to surrender his administrative license rather than face a humiliating public tribunal. Veronica, predictably, filed for divorce the exact same afternoon the estate was listed for public auction. When the settlement funds finally cleared into my checking account, I sat at my small kitchen table and stared at the numbers on the screen. It was more money than I could comprehend. But I didn't feel the urge to buy a luxury sports car or a massive, isolated mansion. I knew exactly what that money was meant to do. I drove to a modest, working-class neighborhood in Boston and purchased an empty, brick commercial storefront. I called Dr. Evans that very same afternoon. Together, we opened a fully funded, free pediatric respiratory clinic. We named it Walter's Breath. We stocked it with the best commercial nebulizers, the highest-grade oxygen monitors, and an ironclad guarantee that no mother would ever be turned away because she was missing a few dollars for an electric bill. For June and myself, I bought a small, incredibly sturdy wooden house with a large brick fireplace and a backyard filled with ancient oak trees. On a quiet, snowy evening in late November, there was a soft knock at my front door. I opened it to find Phoenix standing on the porch, wrapped tightly in her heavy wool coat. She hadn't brought an entourage, and there was no idling town car in the driveway. She just walked inside, took off her leather gloves, and took a seat by the roaring fire. We sat in a comfortable silence, watching June run across the hardwood floor, laughing loudly, breathing easily without that terrifying rattle that used to haunt my nights. Phoenix looked at me, and for the first time in my entire life, the formidable, cold tycoon offered me a genuine, unforced smile. We both understood the profound, silent truth of that evening. Family is not determined by the last name printed on a birth certificate. It is defined by the people who protect you when the wolves are at the door. I finally found my home. People often ask me if I regret tearing my family apart. They look at the old news articles, the liquidated estate, and the completely shattered reputation of a once prominent medical director. And they wonder if the millions of dollars were truly worth the absolute destruction of a bloodline. I always give them the exact same answer. I didn't tear my family apart. I simply held up a mirror to the destruction that Douglas and Veronica had already orchestrated. For 10 long years, I walked through the world deeply convinced that I was a secondary character in my own life. I believed that my relentless poverty was a natural consequence of my own inadequacy, rather than a financial cage deliberately built by the people who were supposed to love me. When you are raised as the scapegoat, when you are systematically conditioned to accept the crumbs that fall from the table, demanding your rightful place feels like a betrayal. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water, that we must always forgive, and that family is an unbreakable, unconditional bond. But unconditional love does not require you to endure unconditional abuse. Walking away from a deeply toxic family is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound, radical survival. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to look at the people who raised you and decide that you will no longer participate in their twisted, self-serving reality. You have to be willing to sit in the dark, to endure the freezing cold, and to build your own source of light from absolute scratch. I look at June now, growing up in a home filled with genuine warmth, honesty, and safety. She will never know what it feels like to wear a stained, secondhand dress, and be forced to stand in the shadows. She will never have to shrink her personality to make an insecure parent feel powerful. She is the living, breathing proof that the heavy chain of generational trauma can be broken simply because one woman decided to stop accepting the unacceptable. My grandfather Walter understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. He knew that true wealth cannot be measured by offshore bank accounts, luxury yachts, or charity wings built entirely on stolen funds. Legacy isn't about the money you inherit. It's about the people you protect and the toxic cycles you refuse to pass on. If you have ever had to build your own family from scratch because the one you were born into broke you, share this story. You are not alone, and your justice is coming. Thank you for listening. I am finally at peace.